Welcome, freedom loving people, to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. This time, you've got myself, Ryan Fugit, and Glenn Korn, both of us former CIA officers. Glenn, of course, spent many more years there than I did. Multi chief of station tours covering a lot of the globe, but in particular, Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Glenn is just back from a trip, and I cannot wait to hear about it. How are you doing, Glenn?
Good to see you, Ryan. I'm okay, a little tired, a little jet lagged. Been an intense last 2 weeks, but it's good to see you.
And let's tell people, we alluded to you going away last time we did a show. And then while you were gone, I did one with some of our Ukrainian counterparts on the drone side, head of R&D, Talina, and his translator, Mike. But while we were talking, you were on the front lines. Can you give us the rundown?
I was in Ukraine primarily with a couple of stops in some other countries, like day stops. But the focus, most of my time was spent on the ground in Ukraine. I have to say, I wasn't on the front lines this time. We were mainly in Kiev, the beautiful capital, and Lviv in the west. So this was for us a shorter trip. We usually spend a little bit more time and visit more places, but this was pretty intense on the Kiev side.
Is that just because of everything that was going on geopolitically at the time?
Well, no, not really. Honestly, there was some other stuff we had to do in Kiev, people we had to meet with that we were not unable to spend as much time as we needed to last time we were there. So, one of the challenges is because there's no flights, everything is done by either train or car. And I prefer to travel by car. And so that chews up a lot of your time in between locations. So last time we were there, we spent a lot of time in the car. This time we had to make up for some of the time we were out of Kiev in Kiev.
Can you give people a feeling of what it's like on the ground there?
Yeah, I mean, this is my, I think my 8th trip in a year and a half or something like that. What's it like on the ground? The Ukrainians, it's tough right now. The Ukrainians are facing a difficult winter. They just went through they're going through a massive political scandal related to a corruption case called Midas case that has kind of rocked the government, resulted in the removal of a minister of energy, I think some of his advisors, and then President Zelensky had to remove his kind of right-hand man, Andrei Yermak, who was basically the head of the presidential office. And so there's a lot of talk about who's going to replace those individuals. There's the political situation. There's a lot of turbulence. On top of that, the Russians have increased their airstrikes against Ukraine significantly. The Ukrainians, the message we got over and over again from our Ukrainian counterparts is we need more air defense capabilities because the Russians are trying to overwhelm us. And although I think the effective kill ratio of Ukrainian air defense is pretty good against what the Russians are shooting at them, they're running out of ammunition. So that was one of the appeals they had. I think President Zelensky has made that appeal to President Trump and our European partners. And then, of course, there's on the political side, there was a lot of angst about the 28-point plan. I think we talked about this in our last podcast. That was obviously on the minds of many Ukrainians. What is the U.S. policy? What is the Trump administration asking Kiev to do to make peace? How realistic is it for the government and for the people? And of course, nobody believes that Putin is sincere about wanting peace, and everybody believes that Putin is just talking to our president and engaging the president's team to just drag things out to keep trying to take ground from the Ukrainians and wear down the Ukrainians. So it's a war of will. And then the last point is on the front. There's been, the Russians have changed some of their tactics. They're making incremental progress, but it is progress. The Ukrainians are doing everything they can to stop the progress. The narrative here, and the Ukrainians are very concerned about this, is they sense that people in Washington have concluded that the war's over. The Russians are about ready to make a major breakthrough. The Ukrainians insisted that is not the case, although some Ukrainians are concerned about the situation on the front. And a lot of that has to do with manpower and then the availability of munitions and weapon systems to continue to push back on the Russians.
One of the things that came up, obviously, over the past couple of weeks in the 28-point plan, in the last session you and I had together, we were predicting what was going to happen with this meeting with Witkoff in Moscow. Prediction was that would be a lot of talk, not a lot of action. You were spot on. That's exactly how it panned out. And we really are still at a stalemate, it seems, just in intransigent lines, both directions. especially around giving up territory. That seems to be a red line for Ukraine and for Russia. They want that territory that they feel they've taken. So I don't know how you get past that one. What compromise would need to be made on the other side of that?
Well, one another thing on that visit of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to Moscow is President Putin made them wait 5 hours before he met with them. That to me is a direct insult to the president of the United States. That's very Russian to do that, to send a message. It's very disrespectful, in my opinion. Steve Witkoff is the special envoy of the president. And, I think the excuse the Russians gave was he was busy with other meetings or something. There was a conference going on. Somebody told me, I haven't seen it myself, so I have not I have been unable to vet this, but while they were there, the Chinese foreign minister came in to greet Witkoff and Jared Kushner. He was there meeting with Sergei Lavrov, and they had him do a drive-by. I also think that's very disrespectful. The Russians probably did that because the Russians are trying to drive the narrative that Russia and the United States and China now are going to make some kind of alliance against the West, against Europe
Sorry, Russia, China, and who?
and the United States.
In the United States.
Yes.
Interesting. All right, I've not heard this one.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's one theory that's floating around, and I think the Russians are clearly promoting that to try and create division between the U.S. and our NATO allies, and of course to scare the Ukrainians. So I have not seen the picture, and I stress to all our viewers and people watching the podcast, I don't think that is the policy, but I think that's what the Russians are promoting. And if it is true that they brought in the foreign minister diplomatically, I think that's unacceptable, my opinion.
That's the oldest play in the book, though, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, President Putin has done this to other leaders. He did it to President Erdogan a couple of years ago. He made him wait outside his office while he was, I think for an hour. He's done that to other visitors, VIPs in the past. And then the Russians at different levels in the hierarchy will do that to their counterparts to send a message. And again, in my opinion, is very disrespectful.
Any feelings or observations talking to folks in Ukraine just about Ukraine's collaboration with France, Germany, UK in particular? Are they feeling closer there? Or it seems to be who they're relying on more and more as opposed to us these days.
Right. The Ukrainians, actually the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries got a lot of high praise. They seem very engaged. Not surprised to hear that. The UK has a special relationship, I think, with the Ukrainians. The British were in Ukraine, let's say all in, even before 2022. By the way, for the viewers, you should know that there is a major rivalry historically between Russia and the United Kingdom. The Russians believe that the United Kingdom has been working against their interests, long before the U.S. was the main enemy, the British were the main enemy. And Ukraine is a battlefield where this is kind of showing itself.
Interesting.
The Germans and the French, not so much. I think what the Ukrainians are very concerned that the Europeans are talking a lot, saying a lot, but they're not doing as much as the Ukrainians want. Many Ukrainians are very focused on the fact that the Europeans continue to buy energy resources from the Russians. And some statistics I've seen are that the European Union countries have spent more money buying gas from Russia than they have to donating, or money in assistance to Ukraine. And then the last point is there's a big debate going on in the EU right now about using frozen Russian assets. And of course, the Ukrainians are following that debate very closely because they need, going into 2026, they're going to need financial assistance to keep the government afloat.
And actually, it's important to note we're recording later in the day on Friday, December 12th. Earlier today, news broke that the EU has decided that they will immobilize the $210 billion asset seizure that they have from the Russians, which means that they won't need to vote on it every 6 months as they've been doing. So it's indefinitely being held, which they think will allow Belgium more space. Belgium's really the one that's holding out at this point because they feel if they take strong action because of where the assets are held, Belgium's going to get sued. So they feel like this immobilization and indefinite holding gives Belgium more room to maneuver and take a stance to actually loan that money to the Ukrainians. And then just for people listening, the idea is you could have $165 billion loan that goes to Ukraine to fund 2026 and 2027 and is paid back by Ukraine via Russian funds that might reconstitute Ukraine's rebuilding after the war, is the thought process. But there's a lot of legal ramifications that Belgium is worried about because they would be the one holding the bag, is their concern.
Yeah. I mean, listen, right. This is a super complicated issue. I don't think it's ever been done before, and it could have really serious consequences for the dollar and the international financial system. So I'm by no means an expert on, finance or financial issues, but I think some people I know that are in the finance arena are watching this very closely. Ukrainians need help. My own view is that Europe can find that help in other ways. Seems to me that they have the resources. They're just going to have to sacrifice some other areas, my opinion. And the US, I still believe that it is in our best interest to continue aiding Ukraine. And it's not we're just giving money away for free. We're getting something back. We've talked about this on other programs, but nothing has really changed in my opinion.
Maybe just after the Steve Witkoff visit to Moscow and how things have played out since then, do you have any other recommendations from a policy perspective or how you might advise the administration on going forward?
No, I mean, I agree that we should be trying to, find a peaceful resolution to this war, horrible war, horrendous war. But I think that the approach of trying to appease Moscow is a mistake. I think we've given the Russians now what 6 months opportunity or more, almost going to a year to show that they're sincere about compromise. They have shown no willingness to compromise. And so, my own opinion is the president should remember Putin does not have the cards. Putin, we could talk about the Russian economy itself, which is in terrible shape. And my own assessment is Putin is scared to death that President Trump will go back to where he was at the end of October, where he started to lean towards punishing Russia for their intransigence and their continued aggression. And my advice is the only way that we're going to get the Russians to really come to the peace table and negotiate in any kind of sincerity is to make them feel the consequences of what they're doing. I don't, again, I understand there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal about Steve Witkoff's desire to do like win, 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 this plan of, trade between the US, Russia, and Ukraine, kind of rare earth mineral deals. Everybody could win, building data centers in Ukraine to employ, giving Ukrainians Silicon Valley, you know, paying jobs type, that sounds great, but that's win, win, win in the West. That doesn't translate into the Russian thinking. It's zero sum. And I think this is where we're running into a problem. Like we've got to get it into our heads here in Washington. It is not win-win for Putin. It's zero sum. And we should not be the zero. The Ukrainians should not be the zero.
I don't know how firmer you can put that, right? Because we've seen this time and again, like this economic angle, and we'll pivot here to the new U.S. national security strategy, which I think talks a little bit about this, but truly the economic side, which makes complete sense to many of us in the West. But for somebody who's covered Russia so long, Len, like you've advised against, just we're not dealing with people who think this way necessarily. And I guess I'm wondering how many more lessons do we need in this? I like that we continue to try. I understand that, but I just don't know how much more we can give there.
Yeah, I mean, listen, what I've said before is I think that President Trump now has a lot of, we used to talk about the rapport bucket, right? Remember that from your training days. We built a lot of rapport with the Russian people. Actually, the president has, and he was very popular with the average Russian in his first term. I'm guessing now that Russians like that he's trying to make a peace agreement, but he needs to make sure we need to let the Russian people know it's not President Trump that's standing in the way, and it's not President Zelensky. It's not the European Union. It is Putin that is standing in the way of peace and ending this horrendous war, which is costing Russia dearly and could lead to the collapse of what is Russia today. And, in my opinion, President Trump should make that, Ronald Reagan was very, very good about communicating with the people of the Soviet Union when Reagan was the president. And it was very effective kind of soft power on top of the hard power that he was also willing to use. And so, my advice to the president would be use that. Use your equity with the Russian people. We got to find every way to talk around Putin and his propaganda machine.
U.S. national security strategy just rolled out in the past week. Very large document, takes a lot of coordination, certainly within the government. Wanted to get your take on it, Glenn. Before that, though, like you've probably observed these being written in the past, possibly contributed to them. I assume, could you just give people a flavor for what that's like when you're on the inside, shepherding one of these things through or contributing to it?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's the National Security Council that shepherds it, that puts it together, with input from all the different federal agencies and players that are in the national security space. Of course, trying to in line with the president's thinking, kind of commander's intent. It's, I have to say I've never participated. Luckily, I spent most of my time overseas, so I was not, on the NSC side of this. But I've read a lot of these. I had a student that actually, I teach graduate school, and I had a student that wrote a paper comparing the national security strategies of, I think, presidents going back to President Clinton on Russia. And I have to say, like, personally, I'm a bit of a cynic because I think there's a lot of work and talk and then a lot of the stuff that's in there is actually never acted upon, or we do the opposite. So I don't, I guess it's good to have a strategy, but I don't know that the amount of resources that we were spending to put these things together, it seemed like it was just a bureaucratic exercise. I'll be very honest. That's why, and I'm not denigrating the people that put their work into it because I think they really believe they're doing the right thing. But there's just, probably need to be streamlined. And this one, the National Security Council has been downsized significantly under this administration. My guess is they understood that it got much too big. Again, my assessment, the NSC became bloated in the last 20 years, way too big, way too cumbersome. They've downsized. I don't know who had the lead on writing it. A lot of people are speculating it was the people close with the vice president because it kind of reflects some of his thinking. That's what people say. I don't know. I can't confirm that. But we can talk about the heart of the document itself and kind of what the the gist is of the document. And there are some things in the new document which I think are very good and some which I don't agree with.
So clearly, just for people who haven't gone through this yet, heavy pivot to Western Hemisphere, far more than we've seen before, counter narcotics, trying to really sustain sovereignty in our own backyard, mindful of different countries trying to move into the Western Hemisphere. That's a big component of it. China as the main threat is also clearly called out. Need to work with them somehow, but also there's a direct competition. And then on Russia, you get the sense it's more like this is a European problem, less so us. We want peace somehow to work with Russia and Ukraine, but to not get involved too heavily. That might draw us in further and cost us even more economically. And underpinning all of this seems to be an economic effort to just build up the US economy and footprint. But Glenn, so that's my read of it. Would welcome yours and your kind of assessment on some of these.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that seems like a spot on assessment to me, and it makes sense given the size of our deficit and the challenges that this administration inherited coming into office economically. The Western Hemisphere, I agree with that 1,000%. I was saying that, years before this, that we need to pay more attention to the southern border. We needed to secure the southern border. We need to pay more attention to what's going on in the Western Hemisphere, Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, all areas of direct national security interest to the United States. And this administration is making it a priority. They've been doing it since they came into office, and I think that's great. So, good for our, the White House for doing that.
Glenn, can I pause you just real quick before we go on to the next topic? While we're on the Western Hemisphere, I think it was just in the past 48 hours, U.S. forces seized a vessel, a Venezuelan vessel. And then I believe Putin called Maduro to offer his support. And I would just be curious of your take on that interaction. Could Putin try to piss off our administration anymore than going direct to Maduro to say, the West is messing with you? We're here to help. Not that they can do anything, but just the optics of that don't sound great.
No, I mean, this is, to me, it's a slight to the president. The president's from trying to, he's talking about having a good relationship with Putin. Putin's offering assistance to someone that the president understands is a threat to our national security and stability in the region. So that should be a clear threat. Like, Putin is showing that he does not respect, and he has, in my opinion, no sincere interest in some kind of bilateral improvement of relations. Of course, Putin probably has to do that because people have been very critical in Syria. He did nothing to help Bashar al-Assad. when his regime collapsed, people are probably questioning Russia's allies or potential allies, or questioning whether Russia really has any influence and ability to protect the people that it said it would protect in the past. And these alliances, they've been helping the Venezuelans for years. I'm sure they have, economic interests. He may have been, and it may just be empty words. Like, someone, what's he going to do? There were reports about a month
Yes.
ago that they were, going to pass some air defense systems, or I don't think they have the resources to do much,
No.
right? So, in my opinion, what Putin did is just dumb.
That's what I agree with you entirely. Syria is even closer to home. This is so far away. Everybody knows he has nothing to offer. Why even do that when the one person you're really going to piss off is I would assume, is President Trump,
He
who is
probably, yeah,
directly looking at Maduro right now.
think he probably assesses that he can get away with it, that he can keep pushing.
This is, yeah, interesting person. All right, sorry. So we're back. National security strategy, Western Hemisphere. What next on that?
Uh, I mean, we should probably shift to the discussion of Europe. What's gotten
Yeah.
the most attention, I think, is the way that Europe is portrayed in the document, kind of the objectives for our policy towards Europe. And there's talk about civilizational decline in Europe. Governments that are suppressing the rights, the liberties of their citizens. The U.S. interest in having a strong, um, stable Europe, which is good. I mean, I think I agree with that. But a lot of Europeans are interpreting this as, the United States is turning its back on Europe, is treating Europe almost like an enemy or an opponent. I don't read it that way, but some people are very concerned that that's what the document is saying. And of course, that, the US is going to shift its attention to Asia and away from Europe and kind of leave the Europeans on their own. I don't think that's realistic. And I think this is just my assessment. This reflects a lot of years of kind of built up angst with this administration or people in the administration. I had to remind some Europeans I was talking to last week that President of the United States, when he was president the first time, warned the Europeans not to continue to play footsie with the Russians and the Chinese, and they didn't listen. And so I think that there's frustration in this White House that the Europeans continue to say they want an alliance and yet do things that don't necessarily show that they're in line with U.S. policy. And, whether it's cutting deals with big Chinese companies that bring the PRC a lot of money. I think it was Spain a couple of months ago that signed a big deal with Huawei that related to and I could be wrong. Like, I don't follow Spanish, defense procurements very closely, but I remember there was discussion about the Spanish signing an agreement with Huawei to do telecommunications for the Ministry of Defense. Spain's a NATO country. It's one of the only countries during the recent round of discussions at the NATO summit about increasing defense budgets. The Spanish did not commit. There was a lot of back and forth. I think, I don't want to give the number, but it wasn't 5% for sure. It may have been even below the 3%. That was, an earlier objective for all NATO countries. People are interpreting this document as saying that the administration is highly critical of the European Union and focusing more on, bilateral relations with individual countries in Europe. And so, there's concern among the Europeans that the administration is going to work to undermine the European Union, which is something that the Russians would love. Again, I don't read it that way. What I read is like, this is maybe a shot across the bow to the Europeans. We need to address some serious issues that we have with our European partners. We still see them as partners, but like in any good relationship, we've got to tell them like when we're not happy with the way things are going. That's just my interpretation. But, if you're the Europeans, I'm sure you're concerned.
And it probably speaks to this. I think the response from Russia after this came out, specifically around how the US is framing Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, is quite positive. They're applauding this national security strategy. To me, would indicate it's probably not great if you're Europe, and kind of wanting Russia to feel like we put more pressure on them. I see your point, though, of this is maybe just another reminder and us signaling very strongly we're looking at the Western Hemisphere here.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
China.
and China. I mean, with Russia, basically the gist of the document says we want to have strategic stability or something like this with Russia, which, by the way, if you look at the past ones, it was almost the same thing. How to work with Russia, which is like a near peer competitor, but also maintain stability, because nobody wants a Okay, we all get that, right? My own assessment is sometimes we're too much worried. We worry too much about that, and the Russians use that to deter us from doing things, and then gives them an advantage. Like it goes back to our discussion about cognitive warfare.
Hmm.
But with Europe, the Russians have been trying very hard to dismantle NATO, drive a wedge between members of the Atlantic Alliance. I think they're seeing this document as a victory on their side. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, and hopefully, the administration doesn't agree with that. And our European partners know, like this is a dialogue. And ironically, the Europeans have been doing more, which is great, but I think they probably still there's more room or there's room for them to do more. And then the last thing is, as an American, the Europeans sometimes I think have, how do we say this? Like there's concern by some people in Washington that they have meddled in US affairs, right? Or certain elements in Europe. And, I don't think that anybody wants that. And nothing like the Russians, nothing like the,
What is that a reference to, Glenn? What are you talking about?
well, if you saw like this BBC this documentary where they spliced parts of President Trump's speeches on January 6th, and they basically created a fabricated footage.
I see
Right?
what you're saying.
And,
Okay.
as somebody who's like been very like engaged in the active measures or the disinformation space, I've been saying this for a long time. The Russians are a problem, but there are other people that are problems too, often domestically in the media space and, from some of our allies. And we need to be very careful about that. We've undermined trust in the media ourselves. And a major what was seen as a credible source of news, the BBC, was engaged in something which was unacceptable, in my opinion. And I think obviously President Trump wasn't happy about it. I think he's threatened to sue the BBC. There are people that were removed from their jobs by the BBC. But there are people that are very sensitive about this in Washington today, and we have to remember that.
No, that and I think the key, at least for me, people are held accountable in that case. Like whether you see the BBC as an extension of the UK government, which I don't necessarily, but I'm sure you can make the case that that's what's happening. But yeah, they've laid people off, and they're probably going to pay financially for this decision, which not every news outlet or misinformation campaign can be held accountable, or even would be held accountable.
That's a great point. And that's one thing that people in the administration should remember, that there are consequences, just like the case in Ukraine with the corruption scandal. Is there corruption? Yes. But is there accountability? Apparently there is, because the President Zelensky had to make some serious changes. As a result, if you go back to the summer when they tried to shut down NABU, the anti-corruption agency, and the people went to the streets, that's kind of democracy.
Yeah, that's true.
That doesn't happen in Russia.
No.
Okay, Russia doesn't shut down its news outlets when they produce disinformation on a daily basis. Okay, and I can only think of one time in history when Gorbachev was forced to tell the propaganda machine to end there was the Operation Infection, which was a disinformation campaign directed at the United States related to AIDS. And when he was finally called out on it by senior officials in the US government, he agreed to stop it. I don't think Putin is stopping any of his disinformation, no matter how many times we've, highlighted it. So
Yeah.
in the United States, in Europe, there are consequences, and that's good. That's why they should be our partners. These are people that we want to be
Yeah.
work, I think.
Yeah. Agree.
And I also think, if I can't just one thing. I mean, you worked in Europe, right? We shouldn't forget too. I think a lot of times people in Washington don't know the actual nuance of, what the value is of our relationships with our NATO partners or European partners. And it's often great.
Yeah,
And
that's a great point.
I said on a podcast recently, like, I very, very much appreciate the partnerships that I had in my career with our European partners across the continent. They did a lot for us. They were side by side with us in many hard places. So this idea that Europe does nothing and that the US is the only country, contributing to NATO, or that is not true either. There are a lot of Europeans who have done a lot, been with us in the war zones, been with us in other
Yeah.
hard places. And I'll say it again. I said on this other podcast, say it again to those people, like my heartfelt appreciation. And I personally grew up, my father served in Europe in the army. I grew up, I served in Germany. I have very, very fond memories. And I hope that we don't walk away from a relationship which has been very productive and very important for the United States. And it's not just, as some people suggested after the release of that document, nostalgic connections with Europe. There are cultural connections. There are common values that we do share
Hmm.
with our European partners, and that we've been working to promote for many years, and we should continue to do that.
Yeah, agree. Anything on the China angle? Any surprise there, or thoughts that you have from the national security strategy?
No, no, the strategy, I mean, I kind of lays it out. I think they have to be very careful because they're walking a fine line with China right now.
Very.
We know nobody wants a major trade war. Obviously, nobody wants a military conflict, but we also understand that China is a significant threat, and China has been doing things to undermine the United States for years and our position in the world. So going back to, the only way to deal with that threat, in my opinion, is through real partnerships. That's how we dealt with Al Qaeda. And the Al Qaeda is not a drop in the bucket compared to what we have to deal with the People's Republic of China and Russia. Let's go back to Russia because that's my area of expertise or pseudo expertise. Some people think that we can, make friends with Russia and that will undermine China. I don't agree that. I don't think that's going to happen. As long as Putin's in charge, I don't think he's going to um, abandon his relationship with China. I don't think he can. I think the Chinese have much influence already in Russia. So we need to
Absolutely.
we need to partner with those people we can partner with realistically, and that would be the Europeans. That would be, and by the way, when I say Europe, that's Ukraine. Ukraine is in many ways, the future of Europe.
Not if Putin has his way.
Let's
Question
not
for
let
you,
it happen.
Glenn.
Let's not have.
I agree. I agree. Yeah. I mean, I kind of like, honestly, that this is playing out this way where Putin doesn't want to come to the table because his economy is suffering. He's having to silence dissent even more.
It
I
was
hate watching what happens to the Ukrainians as a result, but I do like the idea that maybe he's getting weaker and weaker as this draws on.
yeah.
Who has influence now with Putin, Glenn, just before we wrap here? Like we've seen some people in his orbit kind of get pushed to the side over the past few months. We never talk about like a number two. You've got Medvedev, who's out there really vocal. Sergei Lavrov obviously has his role that he's been in for years. Kirill Dmitriev. Is there anybody that you look at like that person still got a ton of wasta or even more than they had a year ago?
Well, it depends on what the issue is. I think Putin is using Kirill Dmitriev for a specific reason to appeal to certain people in the White House in the U.S. because of commonality. You,
Yeah.
me, same, right? You and I know that one. I worked on Wall Street. I speak English. Look, I'm a cool dude. I'm like you. Uh, People shouldn't be fooled by that. He's just a puppet being used by Putin. When Putin is done with him, guy like that's gone. That's one. Two, some people have been like, if you see Lavrov's role in the talks has been minimal. I think because he was so toxic, he was pissing off people, probably making it harder for Putin to appeal to Trump. Petrushev's role has been diminished. It's going back about a year with some serious changes that were happening. I think internally, like guys like General Alexander Bortnikov are probably still extremely powerful. He runs the Federal Security Service. They have a lot of influence. They're one of the main sources of power in the country. Who else? There are a couple of, they're saying that Putin is grooming people close to his family and like Petrushev's son, who he brought into the presidential administration. They're grooming the next generation of people that think like them,
Mm.
right? Yeah. But I don't think there's nobody that, I don't think there's anyone that can go to Putin and tell him the truth. There was by the way, great video someone sent me this morning of a Russian writer who was in a video conference with Putin, and he basically criticized Putin for all the oppression and for, labeling anyone that disagreed with the government a foreign agent. It was really brave. I wish I had the guy's name with me right now, but it was really like an act of courage because in front of a huge audience of people, this guy was basically saying, I don't agree with what you're doing. You're killing dissent. You're killing creativity. How, he said during this video conference, how can you expect our students to think freely and be innovative when they're scared to say anything because they're going to be labeled a foreign agent and arrested? So there are still, I guess I say that because there are still people in Russia who do have the courage to speak up. Now, I don't think that will influence Putin, maybe long term.
And then just as we round out here, we're coming to the Christmas break. At least in DC, things tend to get quiet. I would assume we should not see any breakthroughs Would you envision any coming in the next couple weeks, Glenn, just as we lead up to the new year?
No, I don't see any big breakthrough, maybe after the new year, maybe in a couple of months. But again, I think the only way to get there is to apply more pressure on Putin. Negative pressure, unfortunately. Not, and on the Russian people, I think, again, President Trump has an opportunity to communicate to them and should be using it that he is the president that has proposed peace. For the last year, he's taken a lot of internal beating in the US for doing that and trying. It's President Putin that's the one that has done things to kill that effort. And so President Putin is responsible for the pain that the Russians are feeling. And I think, probably feel more if he continues this war. I mean, on one day, on the front, I think the Ukrainians tell us like maybe 1,000 Russian casualties, something like that. So
150,000, I think they're saying are dead now. Just insane.
yes,
All right, Glenn, thank you. Happy holidays. Hopefully we'll do one more, but just in case. Happy
yeah,
holidays.
yeah. If not, then well, I mean, there's probably a holiday coming up anyways. But for our listeners, look, I do have to say this: like the Ukrainians are in a tough spot, and we should not forget them. I hope, as an American, we do not turn our back on the people of Ukraine right now. They deserve our support. They deserve. I told the Ukrainians over and over again the support for Ukraine has actually increased among Republicans in the last year. I think it's high among many Democrats. So it seems like it's a bipartisan issue. There are many
Which is
members of
rare.
right, which is rare, but it's very, very important. And just imagine what the Ukrainians are facing right now. And there's one of them said, like, we've got to get through this winter. And as Americans, we should remember, like, this is a challenge by Russia to the United States. Like, you can't outlast us. You don't have the fortitude and the toughness. And I don't believe that. I know Americans. We can be really tough when we need to be, and we should be. That is the spirit of our country. The people that conquered, like made this country what it was, they went through a lot of hardship. They showed a lot of fortitude and courage. And as like our generation today, or the generations that are living in the United States, we have got to demonstrate that we can do. We don't want to be the generations that basically said, "Oh,"
I
my
agree.
my personal opinion.
And people helped us when we needed it at different times.
That's a
So,
great point too. Yes,
yeah,
I mean, you guys go down to Lafayette Square. The
that's
French were
right.
there, and many times people have helped us. So
Thanks, Glenn. Great
thank
seeing you
you,
again.
Brian.
Glad you made it back safely.
Thank you. You guys have a great weekend.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it for free at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.